Welcome to In the Middle, a podcast on Christianity in the Middle East, where we explore questions of history, religion, culture, and policy that affects the ancient and indigenous Christian communities of the Middle East. I'm honored to be joined today by Bishop Gregory Mansour of the Maronite Catholic Eparchy of St. Maron in Brooklyn, New York, Dr. George Kiraz of the Syriac Institute, and Aram Hamparian, Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, to discuss matters pertaining to the Middle East Christian Diaspora in the United States. The first great wave of Middle Eastern Christian immigrants arrived in the United States just over a century ago. In today's conversation, we'll take a critical look back at the last century of the Mid-East Christian Diaspora in the USA. Challenges, missteps, lessons, victories, and opportunities. So without further ado, thanks for joining the conversation, and welcome to In the Middle. Bishop Gregory, Dr. Kiraz, and Aram, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Glad to be here.
Before we jump into what I expect to be an interesting conversation, I'd first like to start by having each of you just take a moment to share with us a bit about the history of your respective diaspora communities. So, Bishop Gregory, we'll start with you. A little bit about the Maronites in the United States.
Yeah, so the Maronites started coming at the late 1800s and established communities. By 1890, our patriarch would assign different priests to different places, and some of the Latin bishops would also help establish our Maronite churches. And now we are two Maronite eparchies, one located in Brooklyn, New York, and the other in St. Louis and Los Angeles. We're about 45 parishes and missions in each, so we're over 90 parishes and missions throughout the United States with two bishops. And we have in our little eparchy, we have a monastery of 18 monks, a convent of 3 nuns, and a seminary in which it's shared by both eparchies. And we have about 10 young men studying for the priesthood. So our communities mostly came from Lebanon and Syria. And interestingly enough, when the Ottoman Turks were decimating Christianity in the Middle East, our people came here and on purpose built their churches, especially in 1917. We had this past 2017, we had several 100-year anniversaries of our churches just to show the resilience of the Middle Eastern Christianity. If they're harmed in one place, they build their churches in another. So that's a little history.
Thanks for that, Bishop Gregory. Certainly a beautiful history indeed, and I expect a lot of parallels between the stories we'll hear today. Next, I'd like to go over to Dr. Kiraz, who's here representing the Syriacs, particularly the Syriac Orthodox in today's conversation. I'll also add that I recently had the pleasure to read a book published a couple of years ago by Dr. Kiraz about this very topic, the history of the Syriac community in the United States. So without further ado, Dr. Kiraz.
Thank you very much again for inviting me to this podcast. So the Syriacs, again, as in the case of the Maronites, they start to arrive in the United States in the late 1800s. Although we know a case of a deacon from Mosul who arrived here with missionaries in the 1840s, but we cannot speak of a community. I would say 1880s, you start getting families that are clustering together, more so in the 1890s. And the main areas from where people immigrated, the earliest immigrants most likely seem to have come from Kharput, and they clustered around Worcester, Massachusetts. And we may hear a similar Armenian story because they are Kharput is a Syriac Armenian kind of town. And then from Diyarbakir, they mostly settled around the New Jersey, New York area. And folks from the Tur Abdin, Mardin in Rhode Island area. So this is your lot rich. And then also folks from the Sadad or Homs area in Syria who settled in and around Detroit, Michigan. And later on, some of them went to Florida. So these are the early immigrants. By the late 1890s, they begin to formalize organizations. And in the first US census, where we have Syriacs counted as religious bodies, there are no churches, but there are tons of organizations, both in especially in the Worcester area, but also in the New York area. And by the 1920s, they start forming parishes on their own. In 1916, I believe, they get together in Paterson and they say, well, if we don't have a priest, we're not going to survive in this country. So they elected a deacon who was the son of a priest from Diyarbakir, and then they sent him off. There's nobody to ordain him. So they sent him off to Jerusalem to be ordained a priest. And they raised some money so that he can bring some liturgical books with him. Obviously, by books, we mean manuscripts at that time. In the 1920s, the first bishop, the Bishop of Aram Hamparian, who later becomes patriarch, visits, and he starts consecrating churches, mainly 3 churches in West New York, which later became Paramus, New Jersey, and then in Western Massachusetts, and also in Rhode Island. This goes on, and by the 1930s and 40s, now you have second and third generation. They also started publications from the 1910s. There was Intibah newspaper, then Beth Nahrin, then Huyodo. They mostly wrote in Turkish, but in Gershuni. So they wrote Turkish, but in the Syriac letters. And in the 1940s, we start to see English publications. In the end of the night, as a result of the 1948 war, the Arab-Israeli war, the Archbishop of Jerusalem is sent as a delegate of the Patriarch to collect help for the refugees, Athanasius Yeshua Samuel. But then Bishop Samuel decides to stay in the United States. And then we start seeing the beginning of an archdiocesan kind of structure. It takes some time because there are some disagreements in the beginning, but then with the election of the following patriarch, Patriarch Jacob, he solidifies the position of More Athanasius, and then there's a diocese that covers all North America. That means Canada as well. And I forgot to mention that also there was a community in Montreal early on. And More Athanasius kind of builds the diocese. Some people may know him as the person who brought the Dead Sea Scrolls to the United States. And the diocese expands. And upon the death of More Athanasius in 1995, the synod decides to divide North America into 3 dioceses: Eastern United States, the Western United States, and Canada, with a bishop for each of these 3 communities, and that's what we have now.
Thank you for that history, Dr. Kiraz. While you were speaking, I saw Aram nodding his head in agreement, particularly when you're discussing the early migration from Harput to Worcester, Massachusetts, and that's obviously a very well-known snapshot in history for the Armenians as well. So, Aram, I'd love to learn more.
Sure. There are so many similarities between our stories, our journeys as immigrants here in the U.S. The Armenian story has an outlier in that there was a fellow, Martin the Armenian, who arrived in colonial Virginia, but then there was several centuries of really no Armenians, and then, as is the case in so many of our communities, a resurgence of immigration or a surgence of immigration in the late 1800s with unrest in the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and all that. So you saw some immigration, but the first large wave of immigration took place in the genocide era, the genocide of Christians by the Ottomans. So let's say from 1915 to 25, 30 in that era. A large group of immigrants came. My family came in that group. A second wave of immigration took place among Armenians who had been displaced by the genocide, but settled in Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Egypt, elsewhere across the region, Jordan. And they were displaced after World War II for a variety of reasons: Iranian Revolution, Lebanese Civil War, things of that nature. Second wave of immigration took place. And then a third wave took place after Armenia became independent. The Iron Curtain fell and Armenians outmigrated, many of them, to the U.S. So that's three waves of immigration. So you have some people here in this country who are third, fourth, fifth generation, others whose families just arrived in the last few months. So we have a lot of diversity in terms of when, but also where. So Armenians have roots in a dozen different countries, maybe dozens of different countries. We often have trouble with the census because an Armenian who was maybe born in Iran, but emigrated to Lebanon, then went to work in Kuwait, and then came to, the U.S. What do they put on the census form? It's not that easy. So, but that's a history of our immigration. And over the years, Armenians have been pretty well integrated, pretty well networked community. We've built our churches, our community centers, our schools. I think there's maybe an architectural rule that you can't build a church without a school. You can't build a school without a center. These are always together, and education is very much at the center of it. There are a lot of publications, Armenian publications, a lot of Armenian organizations. With a lot of this effort, this community organizing around one idea is fighting assimilation and maintaining identity. That's number one. And number two is helping the homeland. So I think those are the two very, very powerful drivers of our diasporan identity. The dilemmas, or the challenges we face are common to many immigrant groups. On the one hand, you see the distractions of American life and all that, the good and the bad of American life that competes for our time and attention, and that increases with every passing generation. The good news, though, is that over time, those Armenians who are distracted in all these different ways are also becoming more influential, more impactful. So, we try to find a place for those who have a very high identity but are not super engaged yet with the U.S. society, and also, a way for people who are, very influential but maybe not day-to-day Armenian. We try to find a place for everybody in this mix.
Yeah, thanks for that, Aram. One thing that you put your finger on that I really want to key in on a little bit more is the role that identity plays in the preservation and of the constitution of a diaspora community. Without that acute sense of identity, or at least defined sense of identity, a diaspora community tends to nebulize and eventually dissolve. And when we talk about identity, we're talking about linguistic, cultural, religious, and the like. One thing that I've found very interesting over the last couple of years in my own research and spare time, I've been going through family documents, old journals, archives, documents, and one thing I noticed was the evolution of the diaspora's identity, if you will. Those who came at the turn of the last century, prior to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Sykes-Picot, prior to the national borders that we know today, they identified in one way, whereas today those who come tend to identify, not always, but in many cases, with the countries from which they've migrated, like you mentioned, from Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the like. And this takes on a very different form with each of the communities we're discussing today. So if you could each take a moment and just explain or discuss some of the issues surrounding this question of identity, both as it's evolved since the turn of the last century and where it stands today, and what challenges or opportunities that could come with. Bishop Gregory, we can start with you.
So the Maronites have found their identity. It used to be mostly with the language, Arabic and Syriac. But in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, many Maronite priests began translating the liturgy into English and using the vernacular, especially for second, third, and fourth generations. By God's grace, we have wonderful catechism books that are all thoroughly Maronite, go back to the early centuries of the church, as well as liturgical books that have singable texts in English that make perfect sense and that can be sung one verse in English and one verse in Arabic or one verse in Syriac. So it's our identity has become more liturgical. Of course, it's the Lebanese element looms great over us because, as Aram was saying, there are different waves of immigration. We had our first wave at the same time as the Syriacs and the Armenians during the blessing we received from the Ottoman Turks. So we have in the late 1800s we had the first wave, and then we had another wave during the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990, and now we're having another wave because of the economic situation in Lebanon. But during all of that, there was a sense of belonging, mostly to Lebanon, but also we have many Maronites from Syria and Jordan and Palestine and other parts of the Middle East. But the Lebanese identity has been very, very important for the Maronite Church. So on the one hand, we have a cultural ethnic, and the other hand, we have a strong liturgical and catechetical identity, which has been very, very helpful for us to maintain. Plus, we've had parishes. The success of the Maronite Church here is different from anywhere in the diaspora. Australia, maybe there's 15 churches, Canada, maybe 10 or 12, Brazil, 7 or 8. America has over 90 parishes. So parochial life, parish life, with the presence of a priest, a deacon, a subdeacon, and parish organizations have been very, very effective in keeping our identity.
Thank you for that. And indeed, a faith tradition is certainly a huge factor in preserving a cultural community in the diaspora, certainly 100 years on. Moving over to Dr. Kiraz, if you recall, and I'm sure you do, back in 2013, my home parish, St. Ephraim's Church in Rhode Island, celebrated its centennial, its 100th anniversary from its founding in 1913. It was founded in 1913, but of course the community goes back to 1895, as you've pointed out. I was just about a week or so ago going through the commemorative booklet that we made for that centennial and reading through a lot of the history that some of the, as we call them, the old timers of the parish have contributed. And in those paragraphs, I found it very interesting that in their own words, they refer to their parents as coming from Mesopotamia and Syriacs coming from the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And I found that fascinating to hear these people that we regard as the Americanized old-timers of the parish referring to themselves in such terms. I found that personally interesting. And then today, contrasting it with the waves that came in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they refer to themselves, by and large, by the countries from which they've migrated. Can you speak, Dr. Kiraz, just briefly on some of the implications of that, whether it's a good thing, bad thing, neutral, and in some ways we can maybe bring ourselves back to what it is to be a Syriac in the United States versus just identifying with, an accident of history in the country from which they've migrated?
Yeah, well, identity is always a complex matrix. It's not one thing, and the early presence of the Syriacs in North America kind of reflects even the presence of the Syriacs in the Middle East. Just to give you the picture how it was under the Ottoman Empire, you had a very small population, a few 100,000 people, maybe 3, 4, or 500,000, half a million. We don't know exactly what the numbers are, but you've got communities that are dispersed in towns and villages all the way north as Kharput, south to Jerusalem, east to Mosul, and west Aleppo. This is a huge and vast geographical area for such small number of people. On top of that, these excuse me, the population was partly Turkish speakers, Armenian speakers, Aramaic speakers, Arabic speakers, Kurdish speakers, and even when we say Aramaic, there's Turoyo, and there is the folks in the Nineveh plain who spoke Eastern Aramaic. It's a very complicated picture. And then And then when they begin to immigrate to the United States, you still have the same picture. You have folks in Western Massachusetts, in Detroit, in New York, in Montreal, some in Florida, and also speaking these different languages. And on top of this, identifying with the towns from which they came. There was a Kharput organization, and there will be a Mardin organization, and there will be the Diyarbakir organization. And then later on, they start to form these united type organizations in order to have an umbrella, so that they kind of feel a sense of unification. So this picture gives the kind of the mosaic. But despite this, both in the Middle East and in the US, all these communities knew that they belonged to one people. They were Syriacs, they had one patriarch, they all belonged to the same church, they all prayed in the same manner. So that unity was there on top of this diversity. Now there was the additional problem that they faced in the United States is, how do they identify themselves in English? The word Suryani or Suryoyo are not English words, and how do you do that? We even have early records that when early immigrants on their way in Istanbul, they were not calling themselves Suryoye, or Suryani. They were called by a Greek name that the Greeks gave them, Akhalut, which was a bit of kind of putting people down. And then the bishop of Istanbul writes that, I had to preach in the church. When people ask you who you are, you say, we are Suryoye Qadme, we are the old Suryoye. So people were not used to these 20th century type of identity markers. And most likely because the immigrants in the United States came from Armenian speaking regions, and they in Armenian called themselves Asuri. And in addition, in addition to another fact, that there was a Syrian Orthodox population here, which is what now we call the Rum Orthodox, the Antiochians, they opted for Assyrian as a label. And that was the common label pre the diocesan era. And unlike today, where there is conflict over names, there was no conflict over names there. In their writings, they used Arameans and Assyrians and Surianis and also all sorts of names, kind of as synonyms. But then in the Middle East, things shifted, and we go back to your question of Mesopotamia. All of them considered themselves coming from Upper Mesopotamia, even in their writings. The homeland is Mesopotamia, because the countries of today did not exist. There was no Syria, no Lebanon, no Palestine, no Iraq. Yeah, it was just Ottoman Empire at the time. So they considered themselves from Upper Mesopotamia. But then in the 1950s and 60s, when you had a bishop who came, and then you have new immigrants who came from all these different countries, identifying with the countries that they came from, you started seeing a conflict between the old-timers, or what we call now the old-timers, those early immigrants, and then the newcomers. And then the label shifted because the church wanted to use Syrian Orthodox, while before the name of the church was Assyrian Apostolic. We always sometimes discuss the nomenclature of Assyrian and Syrian and whatnot. There was also an issue of this business of Orthodox and Apostolic. The local people, that means the early immigrants, when you said Orthodox, they thought of the Rome Orthodox. But when you said Apostolic, they thought of themselves. And maybe the apostolic name was borrowed from the Armenian church, because the Armenian in America was Armenian Apostolic Church. It's possibly that it was borrowed from that. So then in the 50s and 60s, you also, in addition to the new identities coming in, as you know, maybe unlike the Armenian case, in the Syriac case, and maybe unlike the Maronite case, we don't have folks beyond the third generation. You start seeing the disappearance of the early immigrants. Many became Anglicans or Episcopalians. Na'um Fa'iq, in one of his letters to Aram Barsom, was complaining that these people in Syria, he said, myth Angolu, they're going to get anglicized, the new generation. So many in this coast, in California, in Fresno, many of the Suryoya, including some members of my family, became Armenians because you went to the Armenian church for weddings, for funerals, for everything, and there was no Syriac church. After 1, 2, 3 generation, then you become Armenian. So you have the disappearance of the earlier generation, and then the new immigrants. I would like to emphasize one exceptional case, and it's present here in front of us: the children and nephews of Richard. They are the only known case of fifth generation, and they go to church. These kids, the Sunday school, they're deacons on the altar. The girls are in the choirs and whatnot. That is unheard of amongst the Syriacs. One time we were in a symposium, and one of his nephews were there, and I told the attendees, I told them, stand up, you're a museum item, you know. It is a fascinating case. And one last thing about identity with modern American politics. When I came to America, we were all counted as white, and anytime I fill a form, I am white. There is this in new what well new our children, and I see it amongst others. None of them want to identify as whites anymore. And that is also fascinating because it shows you how identity is so dynamic and reflects the social and political realities that are around you. So it's a very complicated matrix, as I mentioned.
Yeah, thank you for that. Tell my children every day how blessed they are, and how blessed I am to see them still active at church and carrying it on to the fifth generation. So thank you for that. Aram, as an outsider looking in, I admire a lot about the Armenian community here in the United States. One of the reasons for that, of course, is the fact that they do have a very acute idea or sense of identity, and that enables and empowers engagement in the society, in the American system, claiming a voice as a bona fide and viable constituency. And we've spoken about this many times, you and I, Aram, and how critical that is. So if you could talk a bit about how identity has played a role in that, and some of the challenges also inherent.
Sure. This is something that we focus on intently, even obsessively, because our identity is literally our currency. That's our ability to shape the world around us is based on who we are. That feeling. It's a feeling more than anything else, or an identity, let's say. I'll talk about four sort of, the doctor talked about a matrix, like sort of four tensions or four spectrums or spectra. One is an old one, right? Which is, as an ethnic group, do you want to fit in or do you want to stand out? Now, if you're talking about my parents' generation and their parents, fitting in was everything. Right? Ethnic groups did not want to stand out. It was that's why first and second generation immigrants would give names, very American names, to their kids. But now you see that shifting. So in the last, let's say, 40, 50 years, standing out as an ethnic group has become much more admired or acceptable, and now it's absolutely essential. As it's now through the roof how much people want to stand out, and that works to our advantage. So the fit in, stand out tension has resolved itself, and the answer is stand out. Number one. Number two, spiritual versus secular. As is the case in many of our churches, they're national churches. So there's never been an inherent tension between the spiritual and secular. When I walk into my local church, I teach Sunday school there. If I turn left, it's into the hall and the school, and there's a whole world of teaching and nurturing and activity that takes place there. And if I turn right, I go up into the church itself, and that's where we pray. And there's no distinction for us. It's all part of the same cloth. So that tension is, I think, we've resolved it by having a national church. Okay. Number 3, and this is like really, really deep here, because is the origins versus opportunity tension. Classic immigrants, and this will last 1 or 2 generations usually, right? You'll see on the part of families some desire to remain faithful to origins. Let me carry forward the causes that matter to my grandfather. Let me be true to my language and faith, and let me marry among the Armenians, and all these things that are the metrics of origins, or how well I identify with where I came from. And then there's a equally powerful pull the other way, which is, this is the land of opportunity. What do you need to jettison in order to make progress in America? Is it really important to go to that 6th day of school on a Saturday or a Sunday? Is it important to learn the language? Is it important to get to church? Like all these various things, there's a tug. And at the very far extreme of origins, the origin side of the equation is, parents guilting their kids into activities, right? And that worked for a certain period of time, not as successful in the present context, but it's something like that. Like, you have to do this. And then at the opportunity side, at the extreme, is something like, well, if you're gonna, waste your time, on A, B, and C of your ethnic identity, it's going to come at the expense of your grades, your job, your career, things of that sort. And obviously, the healthy place is some kind of healthy balance of the two. It can't just be, forcing our next generation into the roles we want them to play, and nor is it jettisoning who we are so that we can, maybe make a couple extra dollars or get that promotion. So that's a tension, I think, that's very, very present in our world. We do our best to run programs that align the two, so that a young person can feel like they're moving forward in life while maintaining faith with who they are, and not abandoning their identity. We try to not view that as two sides of a spectrum, but rather try to fold them together in a way that points in the same direction. And then the 4th tension is homeland versus heritage. For many Armenians, the 1st and 2nd generation Armenians who arrived in the U.S., let's say 100 years ago or so, there was initially a concern for homeland. The more time you spend away from the homeland, the focus tends to shift a little more to heritage and who you are and how you feel about who you are. And then we've had that movement over time, sort of the homeland to heritage movement. And then as more Armenians arrive from Armenia, you see a countervailing, homeland over heritage again. So it's like different currents and pushing in different directions. And the trick is to speak in a language that speaks to everybody. If there are once in a while voices in our community that try to turn one against the other and say, well, I care about the homeland, not about the past. Or people will say, well, I care about the past, because it's who I am, and I don't need to worry so much about what's happening today in the homeland. So, we try to integrate those two things in a constructive way.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, those points resonate really, really deeply with me. As a Syriac American myself, 4th generation on my mother's side and 1st generation on my father's side, one of the biggest challenges, in my opinion, has been striking that balance between being productive members, contributing to our adopted home, and also preserving who we are, and finding that correct balance of integration versus preservation. Not so much at the individual level, I don't feel it to be a challenge, but certainly at a community level to properly manage that balance. One of the big things that we've witnessed, and I think the other communities can also share this observation, has been this idea, what I call shedding or dissolving through the various generations, and the various waves of emigration. Like we talked about, there's been three major waves, and it almost seems as though we've had to rely on each successive wave for the preservation and continuity of our community, and that's unfortunate. I'd like to jump over to Bishop Gregory to ask on this same idea, preservation of the heritage from one generation to the next, and avoiding this phenomenon of dissolving as time moves on. What's been your experience in the Maronite Church?
Well, I think what has been a success for us is translating our liturgy in a way that's very, very approachable for American-born as well as Middle Eastern-born. And having music is very, very important for us. Now we're translating the Divine Office, morning, evening, midday prayers, and all of the hymns. The hymns are the sacred tradition of the Armenian, the Syriac, the Maronite tradition. And we're now translating them into singable, understandable English. We're talking about between 1 and 2,000 hymns. So between that and the catechism program that we're going to be putting on in ebooks for 1st through 12th grade, which will have Maronite content, but also some affective videos and engagement with the children and the parents, as well as with our own hymns and liturgical quotes. Those are ways in which our Maronite faith is passed from generation to generation with some excitement, with some real joy that people can share something that's 1800 years old, which it's a joy for us. So I think our engagement is mostly liturgical and catechetical. In the gospel of Christ, it's not just about an ethnic heritage, but a liturgical heritage as well.
Absolutely agree. I think approaching the next generations in their language, preserving the message, of course, but approaching to them in their language. You mentioned the gospel. I think that's what Christ did on his ministry here on earth. Is he brought the message of his Father, but he brought it to them in parable form, right? Because we earthly finite beings can't understand the realm of the divine. So Christ came to us in our language, and he gave us parables of of the day that were easily understood. So I think retaining the diaspora community, a faith community, an ethnic community, it's important to be flexible while retaining the message and the heritage. So thank you for that. I'd like to just go around the table before we close. And I would love to hear from each of you what your greatest challenge, from your perspective, your greatest challenge as well as the greatest opportunity, right? So both sides of the coin in the next 100 years. So we can start with Bishop Gregory.
The greatest challenge? The greatest challenge, to be honest, is to retain and to keep our third, fourth, and fifth generations, because they've become so assimilated in the American culture. Many of them either go to the Latin Church or they might live a long way away from one of our Maronite churches. So they kind of let go of their holding on to their ancient culture and tradition. So just to help people really be inspired to engage with our churches have the culture of Christ, between the dancing and the activities and the food activities in the church hall, and what goes on in the liturgical spaces. All of that is really the culture of Jesus Christ, and it's that which we want to inspire people to drive past a few other churches and to go to their own. And that's not always easy. It's almost like we're the small grocery store, ma and pa grocery store, and they have to pass several supermarkets to get to our place. What makes them want to come to the small ma and pa? If it's not the culture relations, the family relations, the friendliness, the good homilies, the beautiful liturgies, the engagement with the foods and fellowship, those are ways in which the challenges are to be our best, to be at our best, to really be attractive to the young and to those who pass a few places before they get to our place.
Thank you for that. And I like the analogy you kind of invoked, the mom and pop. What would make people want to go to the mom and pop? What's interesting is from the outside looking in, the mom and pop may seem unassuming and maybe possibly less appealing from the outside. But when you dig deep, that mom and pop oftentimes has the best pizza or their best sub or the best whatever they have to offer. And in this case here, I think that that analogy still stands, right? You go to a Syriac church, a Maronite church, an Armenian church. These are the earliest Christian traditions, arguably. Right? Armenia was the first Christian nation founded. The Syriac tradition was among the first Christian traditions outside of Jerusalem. At Antioch and Saint Thaddeus traveling across Mesopotamia into the Caucasus. So this is stuff that's really sets us apart from that mom and pop that we don't want to be. It's what we are. It's who we are. It's our message. It's our history and authenticity as well. So thank you for that, Bishop Gregory. Dr. Kiraz, challenges, opportunities. What are you thinking?
One thing maybe for the listener, what I love about this podcast is that every answer given by any individual applies to everybody. So the listener needs to just like merge all these answers together. But here I must just like repeat it. It's really continuity and how to survive without reliance on newer immigrants. The case of the Syriacs is particularly challenging and existential, more than the Maronites, more than the Armenians, more than the Copts, simply because of that small number that I mentioned earlier. The spring or the well from which the immigrants are coming at some point is going to dry up. And if we continue to have this problem of we cannot stay more than 3 generations, of course with the exception of a family like yours, Richard, but that's the exception, then that becomes really an existential problem. And the melting pot, of course, is inevitable, but we can't just sit and say it is inevitable. So what we try to do is, we try to have these camps. We have the summer camps, so we can, bring our kids together. We have these deacon programs, the Sunday school programs. In some localities, you have language programs, either Friday night or Saturday. But that remains our biggest challenge. And in terms of opportunities, uh, social media has opened up so many things for us now, and simply because we are these minute parishes here and there. My kids now have friends in Holland. They have friends from Lebanon. They went to youth organization gathering in Lebanon, but now they have friends from there, from Germany, from California. That definitely will help, and that opportunity needs to be maximized so that the new generation will feel some sort of a cohesion. I'm not the only one here. There are many others around me. So maybe making use of technology and social media and the online world.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with the second point. In fact, both points really. But the opportunity, being the fact that we live in a different world, it's a smaller world made smaller by technology. When the early days of the diaspora, each community, whether it was New Jersey, Rhode Island, Worcester, Detroit, were in isolation with each other. Now with the networking, social network, and otherwise networks, it's become almost like synapses across brain cells is a good analogy to use, where the relationships cause synergy between the communities here in the States, in Europe, in the Middle East, able to leverage each other's talents and gifts for the greater mission.
Something that both Dr. Kiraz and Aram mentioned, the love for the homeland. Right now, everything that Christians are going through in the Middle East has been a rally call for us in our 90-some parishes in the United States, each one of them to do something for the Christians of the homeland. Why? Because we live in a land of abundance and so much that we have a responsibility for those people that gave us this faith, that passed it on through much sacrifice of their own, who are still in the homeland, and to give them some kind of support and encouragement in monetary and advocacy issues, as many Christians of the Middle East are doing. And I'm proud to be part of that, to see the great support that we can lend towards the Christians of the Middle East.
Thank you for that, Bishop Gregory, and it's entirely true. And I think that's what our work is every day. Both the Armenian National Committee of America, Aram and his great team, as well as IDC, we hope to use our blessing here in the United States to contribute and give back and preserve and support our co-religionists and brothers and sisters back home. To whom much is given, much is also expected. So for sure, that's our sole focus. Aram, challenges and opportunities. What are you thinking?
Well, I'll echo what we've just heard from Dr. Kiraz and Bishop Mansour, that identity is at the very center of whatever we do. That's because with identity, everything is possible. Without identity, nothing is possible. And to sort of put a sharper point on it, and the bishop alluded to this, we view our diaspora as something of great value, something worth preserving, something that contributes to American society and the societies across the globe. We learn from others, we teach others, and we're part of a rich tapestry. That has value in itself. But we also view ourselves as a vital component of something larger, which is the Armenian nation, not just the Armenian homeland, not just the Armenian diaspora, but a global nation. And looking at the challenges that Armenia faces, we operate from the understanding that without a diaspora helping, Armenia's viability is threatened. So we view ourselves as an integral part of Armenia's viability equation. That's number one. Number two, when we're talking about identity, it's always for us a partnership of family and community. You see sometimes families that outsource the identity of their children to a community or a church and say, make my child this. And that's not going to work, right? Unless it's backed up at home. And then other times you'll see, families who say, I can keep my child, I can maintain my child's identity on their own, on my own. I don't need the community. And that lasts until about 4 years old or 5 years old. And then, it goes off the rails. It's always a partnership with priests and with teachers and with coaches and with counselors. It's a combination of families partnering with community institutions that can sustain identity. And then once you have that partnership in place, you just have to update it all the time. You have to constantly update it and look for creative ways that make being Armenian, in our case, attractive to young people, and not only attractive as consumers, but attractive as producers. So we don't have too much trouble getting people to ride the Armenian train. The food is good, the music's all right, the culture, the fellowship is all wonderful. But beyond that, beyond just those who are along for the ride, we need those who are the heavy lifters. We need the people who set up the chairs before the event, who clean up after everyone has gone home, who are the organizers and producers of our lives. And that I think is very, very important. Once we have an identity, and then we have kind of a vanguard of folks who are willing to put in the time and effort. I think if they're willing to be creative and update their approaches, I think we can have a very, very fruitful future.
That's great, Aram. And you put yourself on something, you put your finger on something very important, I think, where you mentioned that regardless what church an Armenian comes from, Armenian Apostolic, Armenian Catholic, or Protestant, there's this, overarching umbrella identity of what it is of Armenianism, of being Armenian, being part of something greater. And that's something that's always been, in my heart, particularly for the Syriacs, where the Syriac identity is more than Syriac Orthodox. You have Syriac Catholic, Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldean Church, which is also a Catholic church, the Maronite Catholic Church, all heirs to the Syriac tradition. And, this Syriac identity, the Syriac tradition that was handed to us from St. Jacob of Sarug, St. Ephraim of Nisibis, this identity, this tradition is far older than national borders today: Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. So my dream, I'm an idealistic person in some ways, has always been to, yes, preserve these churches, because these churches are very important in the liturgical traditions and so on and so forth, but also understanding that the common denominator is indeed Syriacism. And we talk about the small numbers that Dr. Kiraz mentioned, which is absolutely true. But I think reaching that critical mass would also necessitate some sort of holding of hands, and understanding that we are, Syriac at the end of the day, in terms of our tradition, regardless of what church we go to on Sunday. So I appreciate your comments, all of you. Thank you for joining. It was a fascinating conversation, and I don't think it's the end of this discussion by any stretch. But thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard,
Thank
very
you.
much, and thank you to IDC.